that kind of brings us to what you mentioned as well, which is what's going on in Sri Lanka. Of course, it's in a very bad place to be in terms of trying to survive economically for some time. Now, more than 300,000 people left Sri Lanka in the last year as the country battled through an unprecedented level of economic crisis. In March, the International Monetary Fund agreed a bailout for Sri Lanka of just under $3 billion. But many people still feel that Sri Lanka's future is pretty bleak and they're choosing to leave. Well, the BBC Business Daily's Laura Hayton-Gins has been speaking to some Sri Lankans about their future in the country.
You are not
In Matara, a city on Sri Lanka's central southernmost coastline, a classroom of young adults is being taught English grammar. Ravichan Netsara has given up his Sunday to be here.
My ambition is to be a nurse one day. To do nursing after my studies, I like to work in Canada.
Why Canada?
For my higher education and because of the salary. In this situation, I don't think we can get a proper lifestyle in Sri Lanka.
Ravichan's plans are based on simple maths. He says Sri Lankan nurses get about 80,000 Sri Lankan rupees, roughly equivalent to £200 per month. In Canada, a nurse's salary is closer to £4,000 per month. But step inside Hatch, a co-working space for Sri Lankan startups in the capital Colombo, and you could be in any thriving tech district. Is this all Hatch?
All of it is Hatch. So we've got 60,000 square feet of space. It's an old colonial building built in 1910. It was actually built by a tea company, Harrison and Crossfield. We have 800 members and we have 120 startups.
Inflation is still very, very high. It's a more difficult business environment when you have that economic situation, isn't it?
We just had to push through. There are a lot of startups that are leaving. There are a lot of talent that are leaving. But when I speak to the other side of the spectrum of startups, they also tell me there's opportunity.
And in terms of attracting investment, have the small businesses here had to look in different places?
It's tremendously hard. It was hard anyway. But I think in the last 2.5 years, investors just don't want to come in, and that's a massive challenge because at the same time, I think banks are reluctant to lend to startups, even if it is just working capital. So startups are really in this point where they, where do you go? You could, at every avenue left and right, you're kind of stuck.
Do you feel like there's any light at the end of the tunnel with that yet?
I want to say yes. I'm hopeful because I can see what the ecosystem looks like, the startup ecosystem in particular.
Can young people endure years before things start to improve? Many have already voted with their feet. More will no doubt follow, if reluctantly. I asked Ravichan how long he intends to stay in Canada.
4 years, 5 years.
So if the economic situation here was better, would you bother going to Canada at all?
No, if this turn good, I will stay here. I'm not going Canada.
Ravichan talking to Laura Hayton-Gin there. It's an interesting situation, Tony, isn't it? Because, there's many aspects to this. One, the draining of talent from a place like Sri Lanka that desperately needs it. But the attractions, I suppose, to more successful economies can't be gainsaid. If people want to make money, if they want to get a good reward for their skills, they go where the money is, don't they?
Yeah, and given the economic difficulty that Sri Lanka's had over the past couple of years, well, I guess over the past really 40 years, but specifically the last couple of years, it's enticing, and these young people want to see opportunity, and if it's not there, then they have to find a way. So I did, we may have spoken about this before, Roger, but I did run a business in Sri Lanka during the Civil War from 2006 to 2008.
Yeah.
And it was a tech startup, and we actually sold it in 2008. So it was great to hear that section with the kind of incubator and what's happening in the tech scene there. So I can see that there are opportunities because even through the war, there was so much resilience in Sri Lankans and the economy there that I can see that people would be strong enough to continue to push.
But it needs investment, and that was one of the points that came out in this. People are, perhaps for good reason, not willing to invest in a country which has these kind of problems.
Well, yeah, they're not necessarily willing to invest in Sri Lankan rupee terms, and they're not necessarily willing to invest in companies that will transact in Sri Lankan rupees. But certainly they can have expenses in Sri Lankan rupees. So I think, for those companies that can work on those terms, again, it's extremely difficult. But the fact that the woman said that they're, doing so well, just tells me that there's some opportunity there.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Simon, what do you think the answer is? Because you can't force people to stay in a country like that.
Well, I mean, the answer, first of all, lies in politics. I mean, the fate of Sri Lanka, and it is so sad. It's another one of those countries where there's massive vibrancy, there's massive hunger for growth and intellectual capability. But, venal and corrupt politics over the last 30 to 40 years has basically drained the country's assets. And created an unsustainable fiscal position. So, the things that people are dealing with now, it's true that people have always chosen to leave Sri Lanka to go and work as nurses, doctors, and indeed helpers, home helpers in Singapore, for example. But practical issues like electricity supply, you're getting major power cuts now because they can't afford to pay their bills. They can't afford to import the hydrocarbons that they need, which means that call centers, which is another huge business in Sri Lanka, they can't operate.
Yeah.
Because I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting. You talked obviously about the large number of people who are working in let's say, lower skilled jobs that come from Sri Lanka and they work in places like Singapore. But what we were hearing from there is some very talented people being taken away as well.
Potential entrepreneurs and others who left. I mean, I've been around in Asia for a long time, and a reflection on Sri Lanka would be, the great Lee Kuan Yew, one of the great statesmen of the last century, who played a key role in developing Singapore. Singapore now has more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the world. Went to Sri Lanka in the early 1960s, at the beginning of his political career, and he praised Sri Lanka as being an example of post-colonial development, because at that time it outshone Singapore. Well, the difference between Singapore and Sri Lanka can be seen entirely in terms of the quality of leadership.
That's an interesting point. I mean, they've had a war, of course. One shouldn't neglect that, which in itself, I suppose, may be counted as a failure of political leadership. But Tony, I mean, you know Sri Lanka well. You knew it during that war period. Is it what's happened to Sri Lanka? Is it purely explicable through political incompetence?
Well, I think in the wake of a war, I think, what they've had. Sorry, that's a tough question, actually. I think a lot of it is political incompetence. A lot of it was the corruption of the Rajapakses and how long they were in power, as well as the deep relationships that the Rajapakses had with China that caused some deep level of corruption, not just domestically, but internationally. So, there's corruption everywhere, let's face it. But I think it hit very, very deep levels under the Rajapakses. And I think Sri Lanka is still suffering because of that.
Well, it's interesting. You make the point about China there. And Simon, let me come to you on that. I mean, China is wanting to invest. It does invest. It has invested in Sri Lanka. It can't be terribly pleased with the way things are going, I guess.
No, I think, China gets a bad press. I'm sorry. I mean, like Tony, I spent a lot of time in China, and I don't think they necessarily invest in countries in order to create debt slaves. You might think they did based on Western media, but it's generally perplexing. How do you do business with Sri Lanka when their ability to take the money and use it effectively and to repay the loans that they undertake cannot be trusted, and when political dynasties like the Rajapakses simply loot the money that is intended for developing Sri Lanka? It's a big problem.
Fair.
Yeah, Tony, come in there.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, look, the Rajapakses were the other side of it. So it's not just China's fault. And I'm sorry if that's what I said, but it's not intended.
Well, I think it was more my question than anything else. But I was interested in that Chinese link and what it tells us about the future of Sri Lanka as well.
Well, if you talk to Sri Lankans, the last time I was there was probably 6 or 7 years ago. But at that time, the view of China was actually very favorable. Because a lot of infrastructure had been put in place, a lot of investment had happened, and they really hadn't had to pay it back yet. So I went to an event put on by, I think, the WTO or something, and it was in an expo hall that had been built by the Chinese government with Chinese contractors, and everyone was very happy about it. So I think there were good feelings there. I don't know why they would erode, but maybe they have.
Well, the Chinese investment is still there, as I understand it, in fairly hefty amounts, and also, of course, they have this IMF bailout. I mean, Simon, can you see Sri Lanka coming back into a better position in the near future?
Well, there's going to need to be political stability and clear commitment to reform the economy, and in particular to stop tinkering with things like agriculture. Let's not forget that stupid decisions around agriculture, which is a major decision in Sri Lanka, accelerated the current situation.
What were the stupid decisions? Just not investing in the right places?
Well, they were ill-advised decisions made on the supposed basis of improving sustainability in agriculture, and they resulted in fertilizers not being used because they're sort of somewhat demonized, with the result that yields collapsed, and the industry couldn't sustain itself. Tony may know more about that than I did, but I come from farming stock, and it was very sad to see that damage being done by foolish and ignorant policy decisions. So to come back from that, you're going to need to see a much clearer and less venal politics. And then probably money can be borrowed. But, look, on the China thing, the relationship with China goes back way before modern China became a capitalist power. I gave a keynote address, I remember, to SEMA in Sri Lanka some years ago in an enormous hall built by Chairman Mao. With a statue in the corner. So that relationship goes back
a ways. Well, Tony, did you want to come in on that? Because, you clearly know the country well. First of all, what about those agricultural decisions? They were in error?
I'll be honest, I'm not really sure. Simon obviously knows that area better than I do. So I'll pass on that one.
Son. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. Being a farmer's son, I take an interest in these things. I mean,
right. Sure, absolutely.
But Tony, let me ask you then the question that I asked Simon about the extent to which Sri Lanka and how long it will take to come back from this position, just briefly.
Oh, gosh, I think it's probably going to take at least 5 years. There's going to have to be pain, unfortunately. I hope Sri Lanka can learn from, say, Thailand or something after 1997. If they would take, say, Thailand as an example and follow that path, that could be a very interesting and viable path for Sri Lanka. Yeah. Not that they necessarily put a king in place, but I think from a financial perspective and economic perspective, Thailand has taken a very strong path.
Well, and Thailand has taken a very interesting path in the very recent days, actually, with an election. But we haven't got time to get onto that right now. We'll come back to that another edition of Business Matters.